Okay, this brings us to the concluding sections of the poem. And remember, what we're looking at in the concluding sections of the poem are the shifts in the poet's intentions. We're looking, obviously, for the stylistic features of language, structure, form, rhyme, rhythm, imagery, all of those things. But we're looking within those things for how has the poet's position and intentions changed from that opening moment. So we have this return to reality. It comes back to sands of a grey and metallic saw. Now, this word sands is really, really interesting here, and I think it's incredibly clever because what I think it does, first of all, it creates a kind of a sound pun. It's a play on words, because what we're thinking of here, we're thinking of the noise of the motorway. Comes back to sounds of a grey metallic saw is what we're expecting. That's what we're listening for. And the word almost contains a sound echo of the word sound itself. But what we've got here is sand. And so we seem here, I think, to be in the realm of a confused or blurred perspective. That the speaker... Sorry, the man in the poem, not the speaker, the protagonist is still experiencing the kind of, almost the beach, and is imagining, through in a confused way, the sounds of the motorway as echoing in some way the crashing of the wave, the crashing of the breaking of the surf that we see in the opening stanza. It comes back to sands of a grey metallic saw. So that deliberate pun there, I think, creates a really interesting effect. The line underneath, grey metallic saw, is also an interesting image. If we imagine this as the sands of a grey metallic saw, we've got a variety of senses being used in this imagery. It's imagery. We've got a grey metallic saw. We've got the sensory adjectives describing a noun, saw. But what's unusual in this particular word is that saw is usually a verb. And this is what's called a conversion, where you shift the word from one class to another. So we've got something that usually is a verb being turned into a kind of noun in this construction. And so we can imagine that an action being trying to turn it into a concrete thing. The soaring of motor cars is an action, but it does seem to sort of fuse together as one entity, one thing when you listen to a really busy motorway. It's just one constant sound. And so that particular technique of the conversion there, shifting it from an action into a noun, I think shows us in the mind of the speaker the way that he's hearing that indiscriminate, massive, roaring sound of cars travelling on the motorway and being unable to sort of distinguish between each individual car and seeing it as this kind of elevating, powerful noise instead of the sea. The imagery also, we hear sands. We come back to sands of a grey metallic saw. Now, sands we would feel with our hands, and it's a tactile sensation. Grey and metallic we see with our eyes, and saw we also detect with our eyes. But if we think of it as sounds of a grey metallic saw, we're in here the realm of what's called synesthesia, which is where you have a deliberate mixing of the senses. And I think that imagery, again, that synesthesia it can be a type of imagery, but you could say synesthetic imagery, creates the sense of either sensory overload or confusion very frequently. And that's what we've got here, a man who is bewildered by the surroundings that he finds himself in. And we then have the surge of wheels, and the dull north circular roar. So the surge of wheels is, I think, physically isolated there to show us, I think, the actual concrete reality of what's going on compared to his sort of hallucinogenic vision of it in a grey metallic saw and a north circular roar. We've got much more dream-like imagery used in the body of the poem. So we're still temporarily in the realm of some kind of dream. Now this audible imagery here, a dull north circular roar, is again creating a sense of violence and menace. So it's audible imagery. It's imagery about sound. And it creates a sense of violence and menace. The North Circular is the name for the M25, the huge motorway that goes around the outside of London. But that North Circular roar, that single word, gives us that sense of enormous sort of animalized power. Interestingly also, you see a rare moment of full rhyme here between saw and roar. But I think that full rhyme is quite important, I think, at giving us the sense of enormous power in the environment and the surroundings that this poet is experiencing. The contrast, I think, with the breaking and wooming of the waves. Then we move on to the final sections. Muffling, muffling. And these repeated word choices here, this lexis. Muffling, muffling. The repetition in this lexis is supposed to give us the sense of suffocation and I think boredom also. The repetition connotes a sense of boredom here. Muffling, muffling his crumpled pillow waves. So this phrase here, pillow waves, I think what's literally being described are the wrinkles in his pillow. But of course, calling them pillow waves is using a metaphor to show us his retention. He's clinging on to the dream still. He's seeing his pillow almost through the lens of the beach and the sea, the crinkles on his pillow, metaphorical waves of the ocean. And then Island Man heaves himself, another London day. The word here that I think we want to focus on is the word heave, which means to pull something with concerted effort. But here I think this lexis gives us the sense of nausea, of sickness, which directly connects to his state of homesickness, which he is experiencing as he recollects reality. And then the final line, another London day. If we think about the fact that here we've got a word that means dull repetition, and we begin the poem with this language of birth. Another London day is really the opposite of rebirth. It is about the same reality being repeated, which is quite the opposite of a rebirth. And so we go from birth in the beginning of the poem, a sense of imaginary rebirth and an imaginary reconnection with the place of his birth, into a sense of dull repetition at the grim awareness that this man gains of a repeated confrontation with a dull reality that he feels distant from and alienated by. And so what we can then see is that the poem has shifted from an optimistic, powerful opening to this dull acceptance of a grim reality that the man feels distant from. And so we therefore, I think, the poem is deliberately designed to give us a sense of sympathy towards people that find themselves distant from their homelands and longing to return there. And it isn't necessarily some kind of aggressive political critique. It's simply about the psychological dynamic of homesickness and how it can occur even without your control. This man doesn't have control over his memories, as we see in the lines at the beginning. And it is simply about how that feeling of attachment can be deeply buried in the mind and how it can lead people to feel distant and alienated from their surroundings.